Summary. A quiet afternoon turned into a conversation I'd never expected, one that tested my sense of boundaries, reminded me of the weight people carry in silence, and stayed with me long after the door closed. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. I didn't know that day would matter when I woke up. It felt like any other weekday afternoon, the kind where the house settles into its own rhythm. The dishwasher hummed softly, late sunlight leaned through the kitchen window, and I was folding a load of towels that had long since lost their matching pairs. My son was supposed to be home later, and I was enjoying the quiet that comes with a grown child who no longer needs constant supervision. The knock at the door was gentle, not rushed, not unsure, just a polite tap that made me glance at the clock and frown slightly. When I opened the door, I saw him standing there, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, shoulders squared like he'd rehearsed this moment all the way up the walkway. He was my son's friend. I'd known him since he was a teenager, all long limbs and loud laughter back then. Now he looked older, not just in years, but in the eyes. There was a heaviness there I hadn't noticed before, the kind you don't see unless you're looking for it. He asked if he could come in. His voice was steady, but something underneath it made me step aside without thinking. I offered him a seat at the kitchen table, the same table where homework had been spread out years ago, where birthday candles had melted into wax puddles on paper plates. I poured coffee out of habit, though he barely touched it. For a few minutes, we talked about small things: the weather, work, how fast time moves when you're not paying attention. I remember noticing how the late afternoon light caught the dust in the air, how quiet the house felt with another adult sitting across from me. Then he stopped mid-sentence and looked at his hands. He told me he didn't know why he'd come, only that he needed to say something out loud to someone who would listen without trying to fix it. I told him he could take his time. I meant it. At this stage of life, I've learned that silence can be a kind of invitation. What followed wasn't dramatic or loud. It was careful, measured. He spoke about expectations, about carrying a version of himself that never quite fit, about the pressure to be steady when everything inside feels unsettled. He talked about my son, about loyalty, about fear of disappointing people he respected. I didn't interrupt. I didn't judge. I just sat there, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold, realizing that sometimes being an adult means becoming a safe place for someone else's truth. I was aware of the lines that mattered, the respect that had to remain, and the trust being placed in me simply by being honest. When he finally looked up, there was relief on his face, not because everything was solved, but because something heavy had been set down, if only for a moment. And as the sun dipped lower and the kitchen grew dimmer, I understood that this conversation, unexpected as it was, would stay with me for years. After he finished speaking, the house felt different, like the walls had leaned in a little closer to listen. I remember the clock ticking louder than usual, each second marking the space between what had been said and what came next. I asked him if he wanted more coffee. He shook his head, then nodded, unsure of his own answer. I poured it anyway, grateful for something ordinary to do with my hands. He apologized, suddenly and unnecessarily, for showing up unannounced. I told him there was nothing to apologize for. People don't always arrive with appointments when they're carrying something heavy. Sometimes they just show up at the door they trust most. Saying that out loud surprised me, but it felt true. He leaned back in his chair and looked around the kitchen, noticing the small things. A chipped mug. A magnet from a road trip taken years ago. He said it felt familiar here, like a place where time didn't demand explanations. That comment stayed with me. At our age, we understand the value of rooms that don't ask us to perform. He talked more then, not in long speeches, but in pieces. Memories from his own home growing up. The way silence can feel safer than questions. How being someone's friend sometimes means hiding parts of yourself so the friendship doesn't crack under the weight of honesty. I could hear how carefully he chose his words, as if he were walking across thin ice. I shared a little too, not details, just understanding. I told him about moments in my own life when I'd swallowed thoughts because they didn't seem welcome anywhere. How years later, those unspoken things still find ways to tap you on the shoulder when you least expect it. He listened the way people do when they realize they're not alone in a feeling they thought was theirs forever. There was a quiet respect between us, an unspoken agreement about what this conversation was and what it wasn't. I was aware, deeply, of my role. Not a rescuer, not a judge, just someone bearing witness. That awareness grounded me, kept the moment steady and safe. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on the street. The normal world kept moving while we sat there, paused. When he finally stood to leave, he seemed lighter, not cheerful, but steadier. At the door, he thanked me again, meeting my eyes this time without the earlier hesitation. After he left, I stood in the entryway longer than necessary, listening to the quiet return. I didn't know then how often I would think back to that afternoon, or how it would gently change the way I listened to people after that. But I felt it starting like a small shift inside, making room for deeper understanding. Days passed, then weeks, and life returned to its usual patterns. Groceries, errands, phone calls that started with just checking in. Yet that conversation had settled into me like a stone dropped gently into water, its ripples still moving even when the surface looked calm. I found myself listening differently, not just to words, but to what people avoided saying. I saw my son a few evenings later. He sat at the same kitchen table, tapping his foot, telling me about work and plans that stretched just far enough into the future to feel safe. I watched him with a new awareness, careful not to connect dots that weren't mine to connect. Trust is a fragile thing, especially when it's borrowed. I asked him how his friend was doing. He shrugged and smiled, said, "He's figuring things out." That was enough. What surprised me most was how that afternoon changed me. I noticed the cashier at the store who looked tired beyond the hour, the neighbor who lingered a bit longer at the mailbox. I didn't pry. I simply offered space. There's a kindness in that, I think, one that doesn't demand anything in return. One evening, my son's friend sent a short message. Just a thank you. No explanations. No updates. I replied with a few words of encouragement and left it at that. Boundaries matter. Respect matters. Sometimes the most supportive thing you can do is not step any closer. I took longer walks after that, letting my thoughts wander. I remembered being younger, carrying my own quiet questions, wishing someone would sit across from me and listen without an agenda. Maybe that's what age gives us if we let it, the ability to be steady for someone else without needing to be central to their story. The seasons shifted. Leaves turned, then fell. The kitchen window framed different light, yet every so often I'd catch myself at that table, fingers around a mug, recalling the courage it takes to speak when silence has been your companion. It reminded me that growth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives softly, through a knock at the door you didn't expect, and leaves you changed in ways only you can measure. Years later, that afternoon still returns to me in quiet moments. Not as a dramatic turning point, but as a reminder of how ordinary days can carry uncommon weight. I'll be rinsing a cup at the sink or straightening a chair, and I'll think about how easily that conversation could have never happened if either of us had chosen comfort over honesty. My son grew older in the ways that matter. His life filled out with responsibilities, with laughter that sounded earned rather than automatic. His friend drifted in and out of our orbit, always polite, always respectful. When we crossed paths, there was a simple understanding between us. No need to revisit the past. No need to pretend it hadn't mattered. Some things don't need retelling to remain real. What stayed with me most was not what was said, but how it was said. The care, the restraint, the trust. It reminded me that connection doesn't have to be loud to be meaningful. Sometimes it's just two people sitting at a table, choosing to treat each other with dignity in a moment that could easily go wrong if mishandled. As I moved further into this stage of life, I carried that lesson with me. I became more patient, more willing to listen without preparing a response. I learned that respect is often shown by knowing when to speak and when to simply be present. That kind of presence costs nothing, yet it's something many people are quietly hoping for. I think about the younger version of myself, how unsure she was of her place in the world, how much she feared saying the wrong thing. If I could speak to her now, I'd tell her this: you don't have to have answers to be valuable to someone. You just have to be kind, steady, and aware of the responsibility that comes with being trusted. That day didn't change the course of my life in obvious ways, but it deepened it. It reminded me that growth often comes disguised as inconvenience, and meaning often arrives without announcement. And every time I hear a knock at the door, I remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply open it. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give us like and subscribe this channel.